Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to What I Did with Music Today During Quarantine with your host, Mr. Liss, aka Kyle Liss, aka KJ Liss. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2020. Happens to also be my wife and my third wedding anniversary, so I'm really excited to see her in just a couple hours tonight and celebrate. And the title of today's episode is Conceptualizing a Solo Piano Cover. The reason this came up today is because I was spending some time editing an anniversary gift for my wife. I did a solo piano session what feels like an eternity ago, but is only about a month ago, where I recorded. And my wife, before I was recording that day, I was texting her and she said, can you record something for me? So it felt like a really appropriate gift for her. And I recorded the song In My Life, which is one of my favorite Beatles songs, favorite songs of all time, really. And I was editing that song and I thought about it would just be cool to talk about some points around preparing and conceptualizing how to cover a popular song or really any song on solo piano. So what we're going to do is, along with the video, which is available on my YouTube channel and my Instagram channel to view in full, we're going to look at just some main points on preparing to cover a song on solo piano. For a long time, solo piano covers were something that used to really intimidate me, even solo piano in general. I had always had a bassist and a drummer and often a saxophonist with me playing jazz. And so the idea of taking all that away and it just being me and the piano and having to cover all that rhythmic and harmonic ground was kind of intimidating. But over the years, I found this to be one of my favorite things that I get to do as a musician, because it's just me and the piano, and I have ultimate freedom to express myself, whether it's a cover or an original, and do whatever I want in the moment, change things on the fly. So it's really, really fun. But getting to that place of comfort takes a lot of time. So I'm hoping these points, if you're a piano player or guitarist, or really just any musician who wants to cover music, I think it's all relatable to other things. So the very first thing we want to think about is, what is your goal of your cover and what's your intended audience? So for me, I never really thought about this when I was younger, especially, when I really started to get into solo piano playing in early college, middle of college. I never really thought, what's my goal? What am I trying to do with this? Who's my audience? I just thought, I'm a jazz musician, so I'm going to cover this song and I'm just going to do my thing on it like I always do. So I never really developed an intention. So you might want to think about, is my intended audience a jazz audience? Is my intended audience a typical classical audience? Or am I trying to capture people's attention who maybe don't always listen to jazz or classical or even piano music, but because of the force of my musicianship, I'm going to rope them in. I'm going to get them excited about piano. For me, this is what I found when I started to play solo piano again just a few years back. Before I released my first solo piano album of original compositions, I would post videos of myself playing, because I was playing all the time on acoustic pianos for the first time in a few years. I'd post videos on Instagram and Facebook, and I was shocked at the response I got, to be honest. I was just kind of having fun shredding and playing and practicing, and people really responded much more positively than honestly I expected them to. That's not because I lack confidence in my musicianship, but just because piano music on its own doesn't always grab people's attention. So with this, I started to think more, maybe when I prepare these covers, when I prepare these things, I'm going to be trying to capture a different audience. Maybe I'm going to try to capture more listeners than I used to think I was capable of. So think about your goal, think about your intended audience. Who do you want to hear this music? And with that in mind, that's going to shape the rest of the points that we talk about here. The second point is, what's your intended delivery system? So these days, it's really cool. I would say that actually piano music is kind of getting this really interesting resurgence in interest because of all these awesome YouTube tutorial videos that have been popping up. So if you're not familiar with those, we'll just bounce over there to the computer and take a quick look at one. So as we just saw, that's a brand new form of music notation. That's a brand new way to learn music. And a lot of my students anyway, who are in my piano class or my other classes even, they just go on YouTube and they find tutorials that way. So you might think, I'm going to prepare this cover for release as a YouTube tutorial, actually, with the kind of falling MIDI like we just looked at. Now that takes a lot of technology, but you might actually end up with a lot of views. There's channels with hundreds of thousands, millions of views with these tutorials. Or you could think, maybe I'm going to prepare a more traditional tutorial, but I'm going to walk someone through this solo piano cover so that it's achievable for any different level of musician, whether it's beginner, intermediate, advanced. Or you might be thinking, I'm going to prepare this video for Instagram release, which means it's going to be really short. So I'm just going to cover a little bit of this song. Or you might be thinking I'm going to prepare this video for YouTube or Facebook or Vimeo or something, which means I have as much time as I want to play with. So think about how are you going to deliver this music as you prepare the cover? If it's just for you, that's great, but it's really nice when other people get to hear it too. The third thing we're going to think about is what's the genre of this cover going to be? Now you might be thinking, well, it's solo piano music. That's the genre. However, we can think a little more specifically because a cover that is, a Beatles song, for example, like the one I did Within My Life, but that is a jazz cover is going to sound different than one that's interpreted in a more classical style or one that's interpreted even in something like reggae or something like that. You can take a song and then make it into anything. So when we talk about genre, we're talking about our first point. What's the goal of your cover? Who's your audience? And that's going to influence everything you do next. Because if you change a Beatles tune into a swing feel or into a really fast jazz feel or into a ballad feel, that's going to change everything about the rest of your preparation process. So you want to think, okay, what's my genre going to be? The fourth thing that we want to think about is what's the role of each hand going to be? Now, you might be thinking, well, typically speaking, the role of each hand is for the right hand to play a more melodic line and for the left hand to do more accompaniment work. And that's definitely true. However, when I write, I love to kind of play with that paradigm. There's many composers and there's a lot of precedents for this where we put the melody and the melodic element into the left hand. There's entire concertos written for left hand in piano. So we might think, okay, well, what's the role of each hand going to be? You could move that melody at some point in your cover into the lower register. It's not something I personally do often, but it is something that you can think about. And then we can get a little more specific as well because, and this is something my teacher in college, Fred Simon, always talked about. And it's still taking me time to understand fully how to execute this, but I didn't really get it then, and it took some years to really put this into play. But he would talk about the third hand. So I'm just kind of holding up my hands here to show you. So, there's left hand, and then there's right hand. But then there's the hand in between, which has to do with your thumb and maybe your first finger on each hand. And with that, we can create some inner moving lines. Fred was huge on that, and I love trying to do that kind of thing too. So we can incorporate some new melodic material, some inner movement in that third hand between our two hands. You can also think about, okay, well, this goes back to genre. Do I maybe want to do a more stride thing where I play a bass note and then a chord and then a bass note and then a chord? That's what my left hand is doing. Or is my left hand going to maybe play a really active bass line? And then is my right hand going to have to be responsible for the chords in addition to the melody? So what exactly is each hand going to do as I'm preparing this cover? And if you think about that, that's really going to help you again with our next steps. Our fifth question is how are you going to prepare for this? So some people might want to go so far as to notate out exactly what they're going to do. I did that, and I'll bring it up here. I did that with a cover of Danny Boy that I'm still working on. It's by no means done, but a while back I posted this on Instagram and Facebook and stuff, and I wrote out exactly, I worked it out and then I notated it because I didn't want to forget it because it was so specific what I was doing. Most of the time I don't prepare that way, fully notating, but I might make some notes in the music about changes I'm going to make if I'm reading, for example, from a lead sheet. So if you don't know, lead sheet is that combination of chords and melody that most jazz musicians are used to reading from. So if I'm reading from a lead sheet and I'm still actively reading from it like I am in the cover I released today, then I might make some little notes about chord changes or changes in there that we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. So you want to think about, how am I going to prepare? Am I just going to rehearse it until I feel ready and then record it? Am I going to notate it? Am I going to do something else? There's other ways that you can make little quick notes, shorthand. Find something that works for you also so that it's repeatable, because if you really like what you do, you're going to want to be able to revisit that in the future and remember what you did without having to reteach yourself everything. The sixth thing you want to think about is, how are you going to infuse yourself into this music? The thing about covers is, if you're covering a song, that means that someone did it really, really well, right? That made you want to cover it. You love that song. So just directly replicating that song, is not necessarily going to be the most interesting thing. So I would say that as an artist, I need to feel like I'm infusing myself into the music. So whether that's incorporating some different stylistic elements, whether that's changing the genre, whatever it is, I think it's really important to think about, how am I going to take ownership of this song? Because just sitting down with a lead sheet, like I mentioned just a moment ago, reading through a song and recording it without doing anything to make it more interesting or make it unique or make it your own. There's a lot of people doing that kind of thing in the world already. And not that it's not good for you, but it just is a question, okay, well, do I want to release it? Sometimes you might start that way. You might just read through it, and that's great. And that's a really fun way to get to know music. So I'm not discouraging you from just reading tunes. That's really important. But if you're going to take the step to cover it and conceptualize your own solo piano cover of it, I think it's really important to think about how you're going to put yourself into and take ownership of that music. The seventh thing that I always think about is, am I going to incorporate any improvisation? And the answer for me is almost always yes. It's just a question of how. But for you, that answer might be no, and that's cool too. However, I think that a little bit of improvisation brings yourself into the music, like I mentioned in that last point. So for me, I'm almost always improvising to some degree. Sometimes I'm improvising complete changes to the song in the moment, on the fly. But sometimes I've just decided I'm going to play the verse, and then I'm going to play the chorus, and then another verse, and then where the chorus would be, instead I'm going to break it down and I'm going to just take an improvised solo, an extended improvised solo. I used to do that a lot more at the beginning when I was covering songs, and I still do, but these days I'm really careful of how long does that open improvised solo go for. Because the thing about modern listeners is, we don't really have that long of attention span. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to keep in mind, is it quick hitting enough that someone's not going to skip forward, or they're going to go watch another video on YouTube or some Instagram TV or whatever it might be. So think about how you want to incorporate that improvisation. In the case of the cover I released today, this In My Life cover, I just knew that on the last repetition of the chorus melody, I was going to do some improvisation. I was going to do some embellishment. I wasn't going to take a long improvised solo or anything like that. I was just going to create some extra excitement by embellishing and riffing in between the melodic figures. So that's a great way to bring in improvisation without going too deep and getting the song just a lot longer than you might want it to be. If you are doing an improvised solo, you also might want to consider cutting out another part of the song. So maybe that improvised solo takes the place of something else, takes the place of a verse, takes the place of a chorus, and then that way your length of your song is still manageable. And then the very last thing we want to think about is, do we want to incorporate any reharmonization? Now, this video is not a tutorial on reharmonization. That is a very deep subject that I could talk for a very long time about. But basically, if you're not familiar, reharmonization means replacing chords of a song with new chords. This is something I love. I do all the time. It's a fairly advanced concept of both composition and jazz improvisation, but it's one of the most interesting ways to bring yourself into the music. I created a video the other day where I demonstrated how many different chords could go under a melody note. So that goes into reharmonization. You can take a melody note of a song and then you can choose, oh wait, I'm going to do this chord there instead of the chord that's written. So I do a lot of that in my life video. I'll demonstrate just one really short little example of that. So you can see that little chord change that's different creates some variation and creates some kind of mystique around the intro that hopefully draws the listener in and keeps them curious about what's happening as I get into the bulk of the song. So you can think, where am I going to incorporate reharmonization if I'm going to? And that's a great place to make those notes and prepare on your lead sheet. So what you saw on the music stand there is my Beatles fake book, which very unfortunately is trapped at school right now with a lot of my other books. I would love to have it at home, but that's okay. But there's a lot of notes in that book of alternate chord changes that I've just developed over the years for those Beatles songs, places where I know, oh wait, this chord is cool there. And so I've done a lot of that on my own. And that way, when I go to cover the song, again, I have a note to remind myself. So I hope those are some helpful tips for you as you conceptualize your own solo piano covers. For me, this is the product of many years worth of work, but this is my basic thought process as I go into conceptualize and create a solo piano cover. If you've enjoyed this, please do check out the full solo piano cover either on my Instagram at Mr. KJ List Piano or on my YouTube channel right here. And then please subscribe if you're enjoying what you're hearing, and tune in tomorrow for another episode of What I Did with Music Today during quarantine. Thanks.